Good afternoon, everyone. This is Rob Satloff, the director of the Washington Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special event, the launch of our latest presidential transition memo on Red Sea security. Now, many months ago, well before the Red Sea emerged as a front page issue, we turned to my colleague, Elana DeLozier, to take a look at this very critical sub-region, a region of 9 countries that line the Red Sea, as well as a dozen other countries that have an interest in this region. It's a story of great economic potential, a story of great political fragility, a story of great security risk for America and its allies. And yet, this region hasn't quite attracted the attention on both the political level and the bureaucratic level, as it falls between different seams and different bureaucracies, and perhaps not getting the attention it deserves to address the issues that merit, that will advance U.S. interests here. And so we at the Institute decided it was important for American interests in the Middle East, but not just the Middle East, to take a close look at what the new administration should do vis-a-vis the Red Sea. That is the topic of the paper that Elana DeLozier wrote for us, and that is the topic of today's discussion, which looks at the desire for a more holistic policy toward the Red Sea and the seams that divide American policy to this region. I am delighted that we have with us a truly impressive panel of experts with decades of experience in different aspects of today's issue. So let me introduce our panel, and then I'm going to turn to Elana to offer some brief remarks about the study that she produced for us and for the administration. So our panel today includes Vice Admiral John Fozzie Miller, U.S. Navy, President and CEO of Fozzie Miller Group, previously served as head of U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, a role that included commanding the combined maritime forces in the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Delighted to have you with us from Annapolis. Thank you, sir. Also joining us, Ambassador Susan Ziadeh. Susan is a 23-year veteran of the U.S. State Department, served most recently as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs, former American ambassador to Qatar, great experience in the diplomacy of this region and how the State Department approaches key issues in the Red Sea. And then from the other side of the State Department's focus on these set of issues, I'm delighted to have Tibor Nagy, Ambassador Nagy. Recently retired after 3 decades of service, includes more than 20 years service across Africa, most recently as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Ambassador to Ethiopia with service across the continent. So we have a great panel today of different perspectives from within a single major bureaucracy and across the bureaucracies that touch on U.S. interests in the Red Sea. I'm delighted that you're all with us, and very happy to turn the program over to Elana DeLozier, our Rubin Family Fellow, who is the author of, I think, this outstanding provocative report, which offers some very practical suggestions for how the new administration should approach a complex set of issues in the Red Sea, issues that, of course, are now on the front page because of the Suez Canal and everything that has attracted attention from kids around the world to statesmen around the world. Elana, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you so much for the panelists. I'm just so delighted to have this panel where we have somebody from the Gulf side, somebody from the Africa side. We've got diplomats, we've got military folks. So I feel like we can really dive into some real issues in this conversation. And the paper was an interesting one to write because there's really something in there for everyone. It's about political, it's about economic, it's about social, it's about security issues. There's about 18 countries that I cover in the paper, the 9 littoral states, meaning the coastal states, but also there's 9 others, Russia, China, Turkey, all these countries that don't line the Red Sea physically, but are very much present there. And so the paper has a little bit for everyone, and there's lots of Easter eggs in the paper as well, meaning that there's lots of sentences that sort of allude to something much bigger and in fact could be a paper in and of themselves. So, Rob limited my word count. So we ended up with hopefully a digestible paper, but also I've included some annexes that really dive into some of the countries that are involved. So the story of the Red Sea, just to paint a picture quickly before we get into some of the issues on the U.S. side, as Rob mentioned, it is a real scramble for footholds. And part of the reason for that is because there is this growth story in Africa, high GDP rates, high population. If they had roads and ports built, which the Turks and the Chinese and the Emiratis are willing to do for them, then those high population countries would become markets for the world, and countries like China are very interested in that. So you've got that sort of on the western side of the Red Sea, and then of course the Saudis talking about Neom and other resorts on the eastern side of the Red Sea and the Sinai. They're sort of finally talking about maybe setting up some extra resorts up in the Sinai, and so there's real economic opportunity along this waterway over the next, say, decade or 2 decades. But it's also a place that, and Admiral Miller will end up talking to us about a bit about some of these things. There's a lot of security risks in the area. So the one that everyone knows is piracy that went on for about a decade, but there's also, terrorism in Yemen and Somalia. There's war and conflict. We're hearing about Ethiopia in the news a lot more lately, which is not on the Red Sea, but is right adjacent to it. There's even issues with internet cables, and we hear about the floating oil tanker off the coast of Yemen, which might be an environmental issue. And there's a lot of illicit activity and migration, and I could list 10 other things. I mean, there's so many security issues in the area, and the biggest one being choke point security. And I think that our guest here will talk about that a bit. And all of this is overlaid with political fragility, which, we know the story of Somalia as one of the most politically fragile countries in the world, Yemen also, but Sudan's also in a transition period, and Ethiopia is going through, a difficult time, to say the least. And Eritrea, there's a lot of question marks about sort of what its future looks like. And so everyone's descending on this area, and we'll talk about all the military bases in the area. And the U.S. really, what the paper argues is the U.S. just needs a holistic policy that takes into account all of this. And the thing that I think we should really focus on today is the thing that our guests are best positioned to talk about, which is the issue with the diplomatic and military seams. So for those of you maybe not familiar with this issue, if you look at the Africa Bureau and the Near East or Middle East Bureau in the State Department, they divide down the Red Sea. Similarly, the military commands, AFRICOM and CENTCOM, also divide down the Red Sea, meaning that one command or portfolio is on one side and the other on the other. And so when there's issues that cut across the Red Sea, those bureaucracies have to work with each other. And so one of the things I point out in the paper is that that's hard, right? And that there's some issues with doing that. And so we'll get into the weeds a little bit in this conversation about certain ways that the U.S. can tackle that problem. Rob?
All right, very good. Before we go on, I do want to invite all of our viewers, if you are viewing on Zoom and you want to get into the conversation by having your questions part of our later exchange, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and I will do my best to incorporate your questions into our conversation. And if you're viewing on any other platform, YouTube, Facebook, whatever it may be, please email me directly at rsatloff@washingtoninstitute.org. That's RSATLOFF at washingtoninstitute.org. All right, let's, if I can, I'm going to begin with Ambassador Nagy. Tibor, it seems as though the U.S. government bureaucracy may not be set up appropriately to deal with cross-regional issues, such as those posed by the Red Sea. This is, as Elena said, this is a seam issue, caught between the seams of different bureaucracies. You just left the administration, you just left government. Can you tell us how urgent and serious the SEAM issue is, and to what extent is an issue like the Red Sea, was it at the top of your priority, having focused on as Assistant Secretary of Africa?
Great question, and it's a great topic because unfortunately it seems like wherever we have these seams between our bureaucratic organizations, there are also major problems. You know, the Red Sea on one side of what was my beat is obviously a big one. On the other side, of course, was Western Sahara Polisario. That also was between the Near East Bureau and the Africa Bureau. And again, you know, a problem there. But each of our government organizations divides the world according to what makes sense to us. And of course, what has made sense for diplomacy with Africa was to have sub-Saharan Africa together. And the problems you mention for sub-Saharan Africa are relatively new, because when I left my job as ambassador to Ethiopia in 2002, there was not nearly so much interaction with the Middle East countries as there was when I came back in 2018. Nobody back then even thought about, quote unquote, the Red Sea as a unit. Now, however, like within weeks of starting my job, I realized just how important it would be, especially regarding the Horn of Africa and what Elena mentioned was Somalia and the different Middle Eastern players that had different sides in the whole Somali quagmire. So unfortunately, this was not an issue that we could look at institutionally. It very much was between our two bureaus. What made it possible to work on this was the personal relationships that we had developed between the Assistant Secretary for NEA and myself, between our various Deputy Assistant Secretaries. So that made it much, much more doable. But it is too bad when these things have to be handled transactionally and ad hoc. Another contributing problem was that, for example, in Somalia, the competition between the UAE and Qatar was for us one of the major problems in Somalia. But for my colleagues in NEA, for their overall portfolio, it was, I don't want to say a peripheral problem, but it was way down the list of their priorities. So that if we wanted to get diplomatic points, say to the UAE government, and we would ask that that be delivered, when an American interlocutor sat down with high-level UAE officials, they obviously had a list of the main points they wanted to discuss. And what we wanted to put on there about Somalia might end up as, you know, point number 10, and they may only make it through point number 8. Then on our side of the continental divide, in Africa, because we have 47 countries, there's always a crisis of the week. And a lot of the energy and the oxygen in the room then gets devoted to that crisis, whether it was Sudan or the Democratic Republic of Congo or Zimbabwe or what have you. So again, one of these systematic longer term problems stays out there. Everybody admits that there's something has to be done about it. It needs to be looked at systematically, but we never quite get around to doing it as we move from crisis to crisis.
All right. So thank you for giving us a sketch of sort of the diplomatic bureaucratic seam. We're going to come to Susan in just a minute to get the NEA side of this discussion. But first, I want to turn to Admiral Miller, Fozzie, to get an understanding of the military maritime aspect of the seam issue. You tell us a little bit about that and explain, just for our audience, why the choke points issue is so important. I mean, we saw with the Ever Given how urgent it can be, but who is ultimately responsible for monitoring and protecting these choke points? And who are we fearful of as posing challenges or threatening these choke points?
Well, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to Elena for producing a very thoughtful and thought-provoking paper on I think, a very important subject. So in a world where timing is everything, Elena's timing could not be better. And that's thanks to the Ever Given, which gave everybody in the world a tutorial on how important the choke points are. And if you look in the region, there are three. If you look at the Red Sea, there's two. One at the Suez at the north end and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the south end. When I was at Fifth Fleet, and I think it's true still today, we tended to look at the Red Sea and the region from the maritime point of view. That shouldn't surprise anyone. But when I looked at ports that we could use that were in the Red Sea, I looked at Saudi Arabian ports and I looked at Egyptian ports because they were part of the Central Command area of responsibility. At the same time I was doing that, we do have a port presence in Djibouti, but the port was rather limited. The Chinese have expanded it tremendously and built their first overseas base in Djibouti. So if you looked at the situation a couple of years ago, China didn't have any allies and it didn't have any overseas bases. Now it has an overseas base and they're starting to pick up some allies, particularly in the region. But if you looked at Sudan or Eritrea, those were not places where the U.S. was looking to build military ports. And so from a security standpoint, what happened in the Suez with Ever Given, although that looks, in every respect to be a genuine accident, that's part of the concern that took up, daily thought in the Fifth Fleet now sent staff, because those choke points have to stay open. I will say the Egyptians do a very nice job of maintaining security and administering the canal. So the Ever Given was a big event because it was A, unusual, and B, went on for a long time and had a significant impact on global commerce. But over the last several years, in the course of the civil war in Yemen and the war in Yemen between the Houthis and the Saudis, the Houthis, as Elana points out in her paper, have mined the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and they've fired missiles, anti-ship missiles into the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and they've operated unmanned craft that have driven into ships, and it's every bit as lethal and impacting as a torpedo might be. So, given their limited technical ability, granted they get some help from the Iranians, we had a good opportunity to see how the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is critical to success. So all three of the choke points in the region have to be open and safe in order for global commerce to work the way that we all would like to see it work. And the threats continue to grow, or the challenges continue to grow, as the Houthis make progress in Yemen and getting access to the Red Sea ports, as the Chinese and the Russians move into ports in Sudan and possibly Eritrea. All of that challenges the U.S.'s ability and our allies, and particularly those in the Combined Maritime Force. It challenges our ability to make sure that we can maintain the choke points free and clear.
Let me just ask you one clarifying question, and then I'm going to turn to Susan. Between CENTCOM and AFRICOM in the Red Sea, is there a line down the Red Sea where one operates and the other operates?
There is a line, and I'll give you an example of why this is not such a grand idea. So back in the day before there was AFRICOM, those East African states were all part of CENTCOM's responsibility. Now CENTCOM takes responsibility 12 miles off the coast of those states. So back in 2013, I think it was, maybe early 2014, at NAVCENT, we were very impressed by the fact that there hadn't been a pirate attack in a number of years, or in just over a year, off the Horn of Africa. So I was in the UK talking to the EU task force commander for counter-piracy. And he mentioned to me that he was headed to Mogadishu the next day. And I said, I had no idea that you could actually fly into Mogadishu. He goes, oh, you wouldn't believe how much progress has been made in the last 6 months. There's buildings being built, and there's construction and roads are being redone. And I did have no idea, because Somalia is part of AFRICOM. Now, 12 miles off the coast of Somalia, we're managing 3 different counter-piracy task forces, thinking we're doing a great job, when what's really occurring is the fact that Somalia is finally building an economy so that the young people that would be pirates can now be construction workers or drive taxis or work in hotels. So we do have that seam, and I don't think it's helpful. One quick word on seams. We're going to have seams because we divide the world up geographically. The point I would like to make with seams is we need to put them where they do the least, present us with the least challenges, least number of challenges, in order to work across the seams. And this is a case I frankly don't think we have quite right. And I suggested that to General Mattis when I first got to NAVCENT, and he was a lot more interested in Afghanistan, Iraq, and fighting those wars than a turf battle that would take to get the rest of the East African states.
All right, very good. Thank you very much. So, Susan, let me turn to you, and let's revisit Tibor's remarks about how Africa and Near East affairs work together, didn't work together to address Red Sea issues, and get your perspective from the Arabian Peninsula, from NEA, and what you think would be an appropriate way to address some of these seam issues we're discussing.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to participate on this panel. Look, it's not that I disagree with Tibor. I agree with him. And in fact, you know, as often we recognize in government that personnel can often drive policy, and the importance of interpersonal relations and establishing trust with your counterparts, whether it's in adjoining bureaus or even across the interagency. And as Admiral Miller has pointed out, Fawzi has pointed out, this is an interagency issue because you have the cross-cutting issues of NEA and Africa and the military, and within the military you have the naval bases, and counter-piracy, but you also have other installations in that area that are very important. There's a lot of counterterrorism activity. You have agency elements in the region. I mean, there's a whole host of folks who are doing different kinds of activities there. And the coordination and integration of it is very, very important. So from NEA's perspective, I have to admit that Tibor is right. We have so many issues that we deal with on any given day in NEA that often it is really hard to get to item number 10, which is an AF issue. And I certainly face this as DAS, and as ambassador in Qatar. I have to say, maybe it's because the Qataris are so active, like so many of their GCC brethren. But you had to learn a whole host of issues, whether it was Libya or Syria or the Horn. And the Horn was important for us to look at because of their mediation efforts, the Qataris in particular, in places like Sudan, on Darfur, in places like Somalia, where they have been more supportive of the government. And interestingly, even in the last, it's not just 5 years, even when I was ambassador and I left there in 2014, in those 3 years I was there, I saw a dramatic increase in the number of African missions that were being established in Doha, and the number of missions that Doha was establishing in these African countries, and the expansion of Qatar Airways into all of these areas. So it was very clear from a number of years ago that all of these countries were very interested in this part of the region for issues of investment, issues of food security, and that's a big one, don't underestimate that. And also in terms of the choke points and the regional projection of power and security that Fawzi has talked about. So this is an issue that has been going on for a number of years, and NEA has been trying to grapple with this, working with AF as best we can. So if we were to look at maybe some of the actual tactical issues that would help us, I'm going to suggest a number of issues. Now, I'm not saying that all of these mechanisms and modalities need to be established. But I would like to suggest a few of them for consideration by people who make these decisions in terms of what would be helpful, so that we're not just looking at how do we make sure the Assistant Secretary in NEA is talking to the Assistant Secretary in AF. So I think the first and the easiest thing I would suggest is that we should have an Africa Watcher position somewhere in the Gulf in an NEA embassy. I would suggest Abu Dhabi because it's a large embassy and the Emirates do have a lot of interest in the Horn, although not exclusively. But you would also want somebody who can sit there and be able to talk to their counterparts, not just in Abu Dhabi, but to be able to travel to other GCC countries, to do the reporting, to do the coordination on messaging, on policy, to be able to talk to business individuals, to talk to diplomats, whether in the government or their African counterparts in that region, to find out what's going on the ground. We don't have a good understanding, really, whether it's governmental, non-governmental, humanitarian assistance, any of these areas, what are the relations between these GCC countries and the Red Sea countries, and how that should drive and shape our foreign policy considerations as to what are our national security interests. So that's just an example. And as we continue this discussion, I can give you some other examples of things that I think would be helpful. And I'm sure Tibor has some ideas as well. The other thing I would mention is if we put somebody in NEA, AF should also cough up a position and put a sort of GCC NEA Red Sea Watcher in one of the AF countries, and they should coordinate their work for messaging, policy, and feeding into Washington the on-the-ground information that helps to make informed decisions.
Okay, very interesting. So Elana, let me come back to you. We're talking quite a bit about important tactical and operational issues. If you step back for just a minute, to remind our viewers and our participants about the overarching security issues that matter in this region and why everything that we're talking about is so important. What would be your hit list of the most important security issues that rise to the level of making it to the most senior decision makers in the White House and the other bureaucracies?
I think the issues that come up the most are some of the issues that have come up already, right? The Somalia and the Gulf conflict that's played out there. So the Gulf rift between the UAE, Saudi, Egypt, and Bahrain on one side and Qatar on the other, which has now been patched up, but for the last couple of years was raging, and it was playing out in other countries, including not only Somalia, but also a bit in Sudan and in some other places as well, which Tibor could potentially tell us more about. But the rift has now been patched up, but that doesn't necessarily mean that suddenly, all the Gulf countries have withdrawn from East Africa and everybody's on the same side again. I mean, nothing in Somalia has really changed that much since the rift was patched up. There's still talk of what the UAE is doing versus what Qatar is doing. So I think the competition, the sort of the conflicts in other parts of the world, how they kind of end up impacting the Red Sea. Another one might be conflict with Iran that might start to come up more. We see that already because the Houthis have in the past. And they're shooting missiles now every day almost at Saudi Arabia, but they've also shot missiles and rockets into the Red Sea. They also have explosive laden boats, which Admiral Miller mentioned. And so the threat from Yemen, and the Houthis are of course supplied in part by Iran. So that becomes an issue that not only the Gulf countries are interested in, but at some point, maybe some of the other countries, even Israel, might be interested in. Egypt may want to defend against, especially if it starts to threaten the Bab el-Mandeb choke point in the south. So those I think are the two major issues. I think other things that we don't think as much about are things like competition with China. So the US has a view on China, which is not necessarily shared by other countries. So when I was traveling in the Gulf before COVID, everyone was saying China's just another option, like they're an option for us, just like Russia's an option, the US is an option. The world is moving into this multipolar direction. The US is no longer our only option. And so whereas we see China as a rival, and they just see them as a competitor. And so how that ends up playing out, and this is one of the reasons I mentioned in the report, that the US has to be really careful to develop its own policy in the Red Sea. If we outsource it to our partners in the region, we agree with them on many things, but there's a couple things we don't agree on. And the United States does not have the same policy on China, Russia, Turkey, et cetera, that the Gulf states do. My last comment would just be on Turkey, that there's this, rising sort of competition with Turkey among some states. Now, of course, we've got Turkey and Egypt patching things up, and, we could get into detail about all of this, but I just think there's some of those sort of big picture global power competition issues that end up bleeding into the Red Sea area in ways that we don't necessarily first think of the Red Sea.
So Tibor, can you pick up on this and from your perspective, having just left the Africa Bureau, to what extent are the issues, especially the security issues that Elana discussed, are they bigger than just African Red Sea issues, but they reflect Russia, China, the ambitions of outside powers, even Turkey, a mid-sized power with outsized ambitions. To what extent is that a key factor here?
Yeah, absolutely. For us, some of the overarching issues, obviously on the security side, it was what is the threat to the homeland from some of these conflicts we have in Africa, and the most dangerous one is Al-Shabaab in Somalia when it comes to directly potentially affecting the homeland. So that was there. The other one was, for us, obviously, the Greater Horn of Africa, which is beyond just the Red Sea states, is one of the most important parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And the events in the Red Sea very much impact that, because we were talking, over the last couple of years, the really major events that happened there was the rise of Prime Minister Abiy in Ethiopia, the rapprochement between Ethiopia and Eritrea, then the events in Sudan, which led to the overthrow of the Bashir government and the rise of the new government with Prime Minister Hamdok and getting Sudan off the state sponsor of terrorism list. Then Somalia, of course, remains one of the larger issues. And then we project from there into the larger sub-Saharan Africa region, because you have Somalia versus Kenya on potential petroleum and energy and their disagreement. Then, of course, with Ethiopia, Addis Ababa is also the capital of Africa because it's the seat of the African Union. So yes, all of these major issues do impact the rest of Africa, but the most acute mark is very much within the Horn and the Greater Horn. Then you could add the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which affects 3 of the countries which will be considered on either side: Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia. But then again, you have to remember that the riparian states of the Nile, it's 9 different countries stretching again way into the African interior.
And Admiral, you referred to the new Chinese base. What impact has this had on U.S. and allied operations throughout the Red Sea? And where do you think that this trend is going in terms of outside powers trying to project actual naval power up and down the Red Sea?
Well, we see other nations that aren't regional nations, and Elana lays all this out very nicely in the paper, and she talked to it just a moment ago. But we see Turkey, we see Russia, we see China, all increasing their presence in the region. It's well known that the Russians, went from taking Crimea, so they have a warm water port. Now they've got a port in Syria. They're looking to build a port, I think, in the Sudan. The Chinese, interestingly enough, for about the last decade, have maintained a heel-to-toe counter-piracy task force presence off the Horn of Africa. And so part of the reason I think they wanted to build this port in Djibouti, and what they did is they expanded the commercial port, and then they built a military port that is a Chinese military port right next to it. Now, there's a lot of countries that are present in Djibouti militarily, so including us, the French, the Russians, the Chinese, and others. So it's not unusual, and it really sits at a key point right there, just south of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. But what we have seen over the last several years is a greatly increased presence of both Russian military ships in the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, Arabian Sea, and in the Arabian Gulf, but also the Chinese. And so, as Elana nicely pointed out, countries not only have a choice economically who they want to try to do business with or who they want to help in economic ways, but also they have a choice in who they want to ally themselves with. And in most cases, they're going to ally themselves with countries that will help them improve their military and give them some security guarantees.
Interesting. So again, just to remind our viewers, if you're on Zoom, please use the Q&A function to send me your questions. If you're on another platform, please send me questions via email at rsatloff@washingtoninstitute.org. Susan, there's such a list of items that we've heard that are on the Red Sea agenda. I can imagine that someone is suggesting, you know what? Why don't we just have a special envoy that can focus on just this region and, erase some of these seams, and that envoy will deal with the bureaucratic problems. Is that a good idea?
Okay, well, now I know Tibor is going to take a slightly different position, but here's what I would say. A special envoy to deal with the region would need to be tasked with a very specific set of objectives that envoy needs to achieve. An envoy shouldn't be an open-ended, let's figure out what we're going to do in the region without some kind of endpoint, because then it just becomes self-perpetuating. But if an envoy is given a certain set of, here's the strategy we want to develop, because we haven't really developed an integrated strategy, at least that I know, and Tibor can speak to this more comprehensively. But the fact that something that is truly from the interagency, so that the seams even in the military, with us at state, the NSC, the intelligence communities, even Treasury, and all of the different members of the interagency, including the National Security Council, can come together with an integrated approach. An envoy could play the role of pulling that all together. The other thing that would, I think, be helpful for an envoy to do is when they go out to the region. I mean, there are always complaints that the talking points about Africa are number 10 on the NEA list. And that probably is true, because there's so many on an NEA list when an interlocutor goes out. But when you have an envoy, and I saw this in Qatar, when the envoy for Sudan came out, then you are able to engage the government at the highest level of the importance that you are ascribing to these issues, and to be able to really put your points out there in a way that is taken as seriously as possible at the most senior level within that government. So I think an envoy can serve a purpose, but that envoy can only be, needs to be staffed with some kind of interagency group to make sure that what the envoy is doing is reflecting the whole of government approach to the issues and policy and messaging.
Okay. an argument in favor within certain parameters. Tibor, what do you say?
Yeah, I have a love-hate relationship with special envoys. I generally don't like them. During my time in Africa, I asked for several, one for the Great Lakes. When that issue was resolved, then I moved Dr. Pham over to the Sahel, had one for Sudan, very specifically, and then one for South Sudan. South Sudan is wrapped up. My point of view, special envoys are that, they're very special. They are there to resolve a specific issue or a set of issues. Their time is finite. When those issues are resolved, then they can go, their position can be eliminated. Special envoys can present problems because the host countries and always have a question as to, who really represents Washington? Is it the ambassador on site, or is it this person that shows up from time to time? So I think the Red Sea issues are long-term. They're very complicated. They're A to Z. So they need much, much more than a special envoy on kind of a, even a couple of year mission. In my view, it would be much better to have a senior position under the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, who actually is the boss of the assistant secretaries and is responsible for all regions of the world. The Undersecretary's office does have a number of people who follow specific regions. And if you made a person high enough, graded to specifically look at the Red Sea, then they would be welcome in the capitals. They could continuously monitor the issue, advise the undersecretary and the assistant secretaries, as opposed to a special envoy with kind of a wide open portfolio.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So I have a number of questions that people have sent in. Let me turn to some of these. One questioner says, we've had a somewhat of a diplomatic revolution in the last year or so, where states and along the Red Sea that heretofore had not had relations now do have relations. Sudan with Israel, emerging ties between Israel and other Red Sea and GCC states. Does this open up opportunities to address some of the political and security issues, as well as to enhance some of the economic opportunities that Elena spoke about in her earlier remarks? Anybody? Tibor?
I'll take a swing at it. It is not surprising that. Yeah, sorry. It's not surprising that you see countries from outside the region starting to increase their ties with the Red Sea countries. And mostly because the Red Sea countries are starting to develop economies. For the most part, the governments are becoming more stable. That doesn't mean there's complete stability or harmony there. But that's why along with the economic and the diplomatic interest, I think you see increased interest in militaries. That's why different countries, some of which are Red Sea countries, are opening new ports, or other countries that are not Red Sea countries are at least acquiring access for military activity. And I don't think that's a surprise, but it's important that all of three of those things work in harmony. So as the economies develop, opportunities for tourism develop, so should diplomatic opportunities, and so should opportunities for military agreements in order to ensure that the Red Sea maintains a secure maritime environment.
Rob? Okay. Yeah.
Yes, Tibor, please.
It's a continuation of what you talked about earlier, that more and more outside countries are getting involved in the affairs of the Red Sea states. With Sudan especially, it's interesting because I visited Sudan just as the revolution was starting, and I met with the senior most military people, and told me of their huge affection for military cooperation with the United States, for example, because the most senior officers still were of that generation that received their initial training from the United States. So a government like Sudan, which truly is forward looking, is considering opportunities across the board and who can help them in what area. That's why I think, yes, it was a very difficult decision for them to continue with an opening towards Israel. But at the end of the day, they recognized that it was very much in Sudan's interest, because in Sudan, for example, the major component of the economy is agriculture. They say that if, agriculture sneezes, the rest of the economy gets pneumonia. And they know full well how much help Israel can be, on the agricultural side, and, for certain kinds of economic investments, especially on the IT side. So I think you see now a much more pragmatic viewpoint across the various Red Sea states, but that also is true of all of Africa. For example, with the continent-wide free trade agreement, being finally implemented and moving forward. So, but you really do see that with Prime Minister Abiy's Ethiopia, which of course has been curtailed somewhat with the Tigray conflict, but with Sudan, hopefully, some of the others will also go in that direction. But it's a very logical outgrowth.
A question about regional security. Is the Red Sea ripe for developing the sorts of regional security institutions that you see in other regions? What would it take to make a practical and functioning regional security setup in the area? Elena, do you want to say something about this?
Yeah, I can just say that there's been a lot of attempts at multilateralism in the Red Sea area already. The Egyptians have tried this. A couple of the African states have tried this. The Saudis most recently, and this is pre-COVID, created something called the Red Sea Council, which includes all of the littoral states except Israel for the political reasons that we're aware of. They weren't invited, let's put it that way. And it took a while for Egypt to sort of agree to this council, and even still today, Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti have some concerns in the sense of, there's a concern, as I mentioned before, about these sort of broader conflicts. Like if we join this Red Sea Council that Saudi leads, and then Saudi gets in a fight with Turkey or Iran, are we in a fight with Turkey and Iran, which we don't want, especially if you're Somalia and you have a good relationship with the Turks. So even to get that Red Sea Council together was a bit of a feat, honestly, on the Saudis' part. But at the moment, it doesn't have a clear mission. I mean, they have a mission statement, but it's not a, security organization per se. And I think any of these organizations, and Rob, you could even talk more to this than I can, Israel needs to be a factor that's thought of in all of these. You can't have, Red Sea organizations that include Jordan, which has just as little bit of a border on the Red Sea as Israel does. This is a question that's gonna, be something that comes up over and over again with any of these organizations. I don't know if the others have more specific responses on the security side. I see you, Susan.
Susan, yes.
I would just add that I think it'll be interesting to watch the UAE and the role that they play. And I think they're really uniquely positioned to play vis-a-vis integrating Israel more into the Red Sea area and in assistance. And why I say that, you see the impact of the Sudan-Israel rapprochement. And I think the UAE did play a role in that. And I think the UAE will have ideas in terms of technology transfer, investment, the food security piece, drawing on Israeli technology. So I anticipate that they will look to leverage a projection of power in the region that is not only military, but that also leverages Israel as a partner in that way. And they'll do it through military and economic means. So I'll watch that space.
Okay, thank you. I have a number of questions, all of which are basically, so now that we've seen the Ever Given episode, what is likely to be the midterm impact? What changes are we likely to see? How is this going to affect the operation of the canal? How is it going to affect Egypt or the other littoral states, or trade going up and down the Red Sea? Elena, and then perhaps the Admiral?
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment, and then I'm sure Fawzi has some comments. I just want to say that something I wasn't able to get to in much depth in the paper, but is mentioned in the footnotes, if anybody gets that far, is the Arctic route, right? So this is something that's come up a lot is, oh, okay, well, if we can't go through the Suez and we don't want to go down around, the Horn of, or down around the Cape of Good Hope, because it is 3 times longer or something like that, these are very expensive decisions. And so there is this thing called the Arctic route, which everyone should look into as this possible future sort of route that's much shorter and that sort of thing. And then Egypt has also started to say, okay, well, we better get these other options, up and running. Maybe we should expand the canal. Maybe we should this, there's talk of Israel's pipelines, and everybody's suddenly saying, what can we do so if this happens again, it doesn't happen again, right? And so it really has provoked that conversation, exactly as you mentioned. I'm sure the Admiral has security comments on this one.
Let me comment, if I can, first on the Arctic route. There's a lot of effort going into what those routes might look like, with climate change being what it is, and those routes opening up. But there's also a lot of discussion about who owns what, who has responsibility for what. The Navy just came out with an Arctic strategy. There's an Arctic Council that China wants to be part of, interestingly enough. So that's an option. But someone once told me you need a plan B, and the answer to that was the plan B is to make plan A work. So if you think of the Suez Canal like a roadway, there's a good portion of it today that's a 2-lane highway. I mean, you have traffic going northbound on one side and southbound on the other. Where this accident unfortunately happened is, like any 4-lane highway that you see, there's a portion of it that's 2 lanes, and that's where the crash occurs. And so that's why it bottled everything up. If it had happened in a different part of the canal, it would have a much different outcome. We would not be talking about it, because before they built this, which they completed in 2015, before they built the second portion of the canal, they had northbound traffic at one time of day and southbound traffic at the other time of day. You ran it just like a 1-lane road. But I will say the Egyptians generally do a very good job with security and a very, very good job with administration. So there were 2 Egyptian pilots on board this ship, and there was a captain. And so any one of them should have played a role in making sure that this mishap didn't occur. So I think you'll see some reform in that regard. I don't think, as Elena said, I don't think we're going to see ships planning, or shipping companies planning on going around the southern tip of Africa, because it's too time consuming and too costly already. So I think you'll see some improvements in how the canal is administered. If there's going to be some future growth that gives you 2-way traffic from beginning to end, that will take some time to accomplish, and that may be, in fact, the outcome.
Any other comment on the impact of the Ever Given? Okay. I have a number of questions that I think were triggered perhaps by your comment earlier, Tibor, about, or maybe it was you, Elena, about how different countries in the region may view China differently than we view China. And the question I received is, so how are we approaching current and potential partners up and down the Red Sea? Are we compelling them to make choices? Are we engaging them in a bit of competition with China? Or what is the memo that our diplomats up and down the Red Sea have in terms of their talking point on this issue. All right, Tibor.
Yeah, I can't speak for the incoming administration, but it seems from all evidence that they're going to continue what we did. Obviously, we recognized that it's not going to work to I can only talk about the African side, that it's not going to work to ask countries to make a choice between the United States and China. In Africa, in 2008, China surpassed the United States as Africa's largest trading partner, and it's been all uphill for them since then. So that was a no-win proposition. The points that really did make headway in Africa was the whole concept of using, from our point of view, the US, but we can say the Western private sector, to create jobs for Africa's growing youth population, what we call a youth tsunami, because Africa's population is doubling between now and 2050. And even the most autocratic presidents recognize that if they do not get jobs for their young people, then they're going to be hanging from a lamppost. So they very much wanted the US investment. So we could make a very good selling point on why Western companies really helped in that regard, and then helped with other things like not importing every laborer above turning a shovel, to transfer technology, to do training, to treat women employees the same, fairness and equity that they treat male employees. They don't smuggle out rhino horn and elephant tusks and things like that. So that was a very good selling point. The other one was that everybody acknowledges that it's the United States of America that has basically built Africa's healthcare systems and keeps millions and millions of Africans alive through the PEPFAR program. So, oftentimes they would point to a stadium and say, well, look at Chinese built for us. And we could say quite honestly, yeah, but the stadium would be empty and there'd be a huge cemetery next to it if not for the United States of America saving your people's lives, with PEPFAR. And then also, by the way, let's look at life cycle costing instead of the initial cost of the contract, which always comes with an envelope stuffed with cash that's handed under the table. So there were a lot of really good selling points. And these really worked, especially with younger Africans, who want the same kind of things that young people do everywhere else. And they're sick and tired of these dictators that are 3 or 4 times as old as they are. They want to get rid of them. And they're sick and tired of the corruption. And everybody realizes that China is there for an autocratic system. They only work with the party in place. And oh, by the way, try having freedom of religion in China when Africa is the most religious continent, where you have a greater percentage of people attending either church services or worshiping at a mosque than any other continent in the world.
Thank you. And just for those of you who don't know, the acronym PEPFAR is the Bush administration era program to counter AIDS in Africa, and a very significant amount of U.S. funding and effort into this program. Susan, and then Elana, you wanted to come in on this issue?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, with regards to the NEA region and particularly the GCC countries vis-a-vis China, these countries, of course, are dependent upon energy and sale of energy for a huge part of their budget, the majority of their budget. And China is their biggest trading partner right now. I mean, even in the last 10 years, it is not just recently, China has surpassed the US as the largest trading partner for Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis, as one of the Red Sea partners, are not going to turn their back on China. And that is true in terms of energy and other kinds of technology and know-how between China and these GCC countries. But I would argue that even though we keep saying, well, I don't know how long we're going to be there in the region, and there are always question marks about our presence there, our ability to provide the security environment that these GCC countries need and want, particularly vis-a-vis Iran, is critical. And they know that the Chinese are not going to be able to step into that role certainly not in the short term, and I'm not even sure about the long term. So while we would not say to them, you have to pick either us or China, we realize that they're not in the position to do so. We also understand what they're going to turn to the Chinese for and what they're going to turn to us for. And right now, we've been able to manage a modus vivendi based upon that understanding.
Thank you. Elena, on this?
Rob, I just wanted to give a couple numbers. So for folks on the call who may not realize why East Africa is seen as such a market. So Ethiopia has over 100 million people, and this is before the population boom that Tibor is mentioning. Sudan has about the same. I'm sorry, not Sudan. Egypt has about the same. So Ethiopia and Egypt both have 100+ million people. Sudan has something like 40 million. Saudi has something like 30 million. Yemen, 28, 30 million, something like that. Even Somalia, 15 million. So if you start adding up these numbers to give a point of comparison, the US is 300, give or take 330 maybe million people. So we are seen as a massive market, right, for a country like China, we being the United States. And so the Red Sea, it looks like a market like that. If you just build some nicer ports and you get some railroads or some roads from the ports into these, these countries, which sit right near the coast, so like not a big deal. If we can just build some of that infrastructure, we have these massive markets. And then those can not only be consumer markets, and for America, this is very, Coca-Cola would love these markets, and does already operate, right? But the United States tends to do foreign direct investment, and China, Turkey, some other countries tend to do more infrastructure related investment. So there is a little bit of a qualitative difference in the kind of investment. I would just add one other point about numbers, which is there were 150,000 Ethiopians that crossed across the Red Sea to Yemen before COVID, a year, 140, 160,000. That suggests what a problem the economy in Ethiopia is, that these folks are going to Yemen in order to try to make their way to Saudi. And the reason I just mentioned that number is to Tibor's point about young people are so desperate in their countries that they are walking from Ethiopia. I saw them. I've been on those roads myself. I went to Djibouti and I saw the migrants and I saw the refugees from Yemen. They are walking across volcanic rock in Djibouti to get to a center that then they take a boat. As the Yemeni refugees are coming one way across the water, they're getting on the same boat and going the other way in hopes of getting a job in Saudi Arabia, and then they're getting deported back home. And so the numbers are, it's not 1,000 people, it's 150,000 people. So it just suggests so I wanted to contrast the economic potential with the economic problems in the region. And this is where the tussles kind of exist.
Fascinating. All right, so we only have a couple of minutes left. I do have a question for you, Fawzi. If one of the most significant Red Sea issues concerns Yemen and the Houthis and the Iranian support for the Houthis, why is it so difficult to stop the flow of Iranian weapons into supporting the Houthi operations, especially their missile capabilities?
Well, it's an excellent question, and it is something that NAVCENT has worked on and occasionally has a success, but clearly more often than not, these weapons are getting through. The reason that it occurs is there's all sorts of traffic that goes between Iran and Oman, or Iran and Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, and it happens on a routine basis. And so it's not difficult to smuggle something in. And when you look at some of the weapons catches that we have found, the sophistication by which they're hidden is impressive. It's every bit as impressive as the other things that transit along these routes, like drugs or human beings being trafficked. So it seems like a relatively easy thing, but if you look at the Combined Maritime Force on any given day, they've got maybe 3 ships that are dedicated to maintaining maritime security. And that would include finding drug smuggling ships and finding ships that are shipping weapons. So imagine trying to defend the east coast of the United States with 3 ships and then say, yeah, we're not going to let any weapons get smuggled in. It just wouldn't work. And so we think that these weapons in some cases get shipped into Oman and then go overland into Yemen. And in other cases, they go directly to ports in Yemen. But it's a problem, and it's a very difficult problem to combat, because there's no support for the smuggled weapons on the Yemeni side. The legitimate government doesn't have the capacity or really the desire to do it, because they're busy doing other things. And the Houthis, of course, are the ones that are facilitating this. And so it's not a problem that will soon be solved.
Okay, well, thank you very much for clarifying that. Our friends, we've reached the end of our time. I always try to be mindful of our attendees' time. And I want to thank you. This is a fascinating discussion at the strategic level and the operational level to address a sub-region that, for those of us who focus on the Middle East, is a growing importance to Middle East security, but I certainly recognize that it's bigger than just the Middle East, and that it touches on Africa and even broader strategic issues. So I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank you, Elana, for the work you've done to put this on our collective agenda. Admiral, Ambassador, Elana, thank you all very much.